Welcome to the Book of Exodus series on the Town and Field Church podcast. In this 40-day series, one of us at Town and Field will be taking a quick look at one of the chapters of Exodus and sharing some ideas around the text. To learn more about this reading plan and podcast, visit townandfield.ca/reading plans. Now enjoy today's episode.
Hey, this is Ryan. Thanks so much for joining me as we look into Exodus chapter 2. Exodus chapter 2 is kind of broken into two halves, and in each half, Moses' life is threatened, and then he is rescued by some cool story. And what happens at the start of chapter 2 is that Moses' life is threatened because, if you remember in chapter 1, the Pharaoh, the king, had said that all the Hebrew boys needed to be thrown into the Nile River. And it actually says at the end of chapter 1 that Pharaoh told all the people to be a part of this, to all his people. He says, every Hebrew boy that is born you must throw into the Nile, but let every girl live. So it's crazy. I think there's a lot of irony in the books of Exodus, and here we see an example of that. When God created the land of Egypt, it's this desert land, it'd be a harder land to survive, and what did he put in there? He created it with this beautiful flowing river called the Nile, a life spring through this bare and dry desert for people to drink from and for people to find life in. Yet there's this Pharaoh who ironically takes that wellspring of life and turns it into a place of death, as Hebrew baby boys are brutally killed in that. And we're actually going to see another twist where God brings in some more irony and kind of flips that upside down later on. What happens is we see that this new baby is born, and the mom obviously doesn't want him thrown into the Nile, so what she does, she actually puts him into the Nile in a basket, and his name is Moses, and his sister guides this basket down the river. Now, in Exodus 1, we see that some women start to undo Pharaoh's plan. Pharaoh's plan is like, I'll get rid of all the boys, it'll be no problem. There's actually some women that God's plan starts to unfurl through. And there are so many of these females showing up in these early chapters of Exodus that are doing these really cool things. And so Moses' sister guides Moses down this river. And who finds Moses? Well, ironically, the Pharaoh is trying to get rid of the sons because the sons might pose a threat, and Pharaoh's own daughter finds Moses. And the language she says in verse 10, she says, I'm going to name him Moses, saying I drew him out of the water. That name Moses comes from this idea of drawing him out of the water. And this is really cool because she rescues him out of the water, she draws him out. And later we're going to see in Exodus that God is actually going to draw the people out of the land. He's going to rescue them from the land. So he's saved that way. Then he grows up, and all of a sudden this jumps to a later point in his life. If you read in Acts 7, Stephen says that he's 40 years old. So somewhere around that, all of a sudden Moses is going out and he sees he's grown up in an Egyptian household, but he sees this Egyptian oppressing this Hebrew person. And he intervenes, and Moses actually takes justice into his own hands and kills the Egyptian person who's oppressing the Hebrew. So you can see that Moses has this identity in this Egyptian place, and we're going to see that he obviously has some Egyptian tendencies because in verse 19, the girls think that he's an Egyptian, but he also identifies with the Hebrew people. Anyways, this gets found out. Pharaoh's mad, and he wants to kill Moses, so Moses flees, and he takes off. This guy who has an identity with the Egyptian household he grew up with, but also with this Hebrew people that he's one of, that he's part of, now has lost his identity in both, because even the Hebrew people seem to be upset with him if you look in the narrative. And Moses goes, and I love this, he goes to a well. And this should throw our minds back to a couple stories in Genesis where a guy shows up at the well and meets a woman there, and eventually it leads to him getting married. And the same thing happens. Moses shows up at this well, gets connected to this family in this type scene of kind of woman at the well, meeting guy at the well, and they end up getting married. So Moses goes to be with them and starts to build this new life there. And I just want to draw your minds to this. This is how the chapter wraps up in verse 23. During that long period, the king of Egypt died. The Israelites groaned in their slavery and cried out, and their cry for help because of their slavery went up to God. God heard their groaning, and he remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. Love this, verse 25. So God looked on the Israelites and was concerned about them. Some translations just say, and God knew. God is a God that knows. God is a God that hears the concerns and the frustrations. And God is a God that cares and empathizes. And this is a God who's going to work out his will as we continue to read the book of Exodus.